I was 17, staring at the cold Seattle rain and counting the days. 53. That was the countdown to my 18th birthday, the day the system would officially spit me out with nothing but a backpack and a hollow good luck. I was already bracing for life on the streets when Ms. Vance walked in. She didn't have that tired caseworker look. She held a sharp leather briefcase and a stare that cut right through me. "Caleb Reed," she said, "your grandfather left you his orchard, but we're running out of time, and so are you." I followed my caseworker down the linoleum hallway, the squeak of my worn sneakers echoing against the sterile walls. We passed the laundry room, where the smell of industrial detergent always seemed to hang heavy in the air, and moved toward the small, private office at the end. Through the narrow glass pane in the door, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't wearing the usual exhausted expression of a social worker. She looked sharp, professional, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than all my belongings combined. "Caleb, this is Miss Eleanor Vance," my caseworker said, stepping back to let me enter. The woman stood up, offering a hand that I didn't take. I just sat down in the plastic chair across from her, crossing my arms. When you grow up in this system, you learn to read the room before you hear the news. Usually, a stranger in a suit means another foster family had looked at my file and decided I was too much trouble, or my caseworker was moving me to another facility across the state. "I'm an attorney from Portland, Caleb," Ms. Vance began, her voice steady and unsentimental. She opened a heavy leather briefcase on the desk, pulling out a stack of documents. "I'm here to discuss the estate of Arthur Reed. He passed away 3 weeks ago." The name hit me like a physical weight, but I didn't let it show. Arthur Reed, my father's father. A man I'd only seen in one yellowed photograph my mother used to keep in her wallet before she disappeared. "I don't have a grandfather," I said, my voice flat. "I don't have anyone. That's why I'm sitting in this room." Ms. Vance didn't flinch at my tone. She simply slid a photograph across the desk. It was an aerial shot of a cliffside, covered in rows of gnarled trees that stretched toward the gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean. "Your grandfather owned a cider orchard on the Oregon coast. According to his will, he's left the entire property to you. The land, the house, the processing facility, all of it." I looked at the photo, then back at her. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, flared up in my chest. So he waited until he was dead to remember I existed? He let me rot in group homes for 10 years, and now I'm supposed to care about his trees? No thanks. Keep it. Sell it. I don't care. I stood up to leave, but she didn't try to stop me. She just kept her eyes on the documents. My reaction was a classic case of what some might call hyper-independence, though I didn't have a name for it back then. When you spend your life being pushed from one home to another, where people only stay until they find something better, you build a shield. You convince yourself that you don't need anyone, that you are your own island. It's a survival mechanism. If you don't let anyone in, they can't hurt you when they leave. I'd spent years perfecting that shield, turning my loneliness into a weapon. I hated the idea of a gift I hadn't earned from a man who hadn't been there. "Caleb," Ms. Vance said, her voice stopping me at the door, "there's a reason he waited. And there's a reason I'm here now instead of just sending you a check. This orchard is in debt. Significant debt. If you don't sign these papers and show up at that property within 60 days to begin the harvest, the bank will seize it. Everything your family built over the last century will be paved over for a luxury resort." I looked back at her. The shield felt heavy, and for the first time I felt a crack in it. I had 53 days until I was on the street. This was a choice between the pavement I knew or a legacy I didn't. "Coastal Oregon," I whispered, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Why did he wait? Read the file, Caleb, she said, sliding the leather briefcase toward me. The answers are in there. But the choice is yours. You can walk out that door and be free of him, or you can take the train south and find out who you actually are. I stared at Miss Vance, my jaw tight, watching the gray Seattle rain streak across the window behind her. I saw the hoarse skepticism in my own reflection in the glass of her watch. You told me it took you 2 weeks to find me, I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. But if this man, this Arthur Reed, really was my grandfather, and he had this massive orchard, why did he let me stay here for 6 years? If he knew I existed, why wait until he's a ghost to reach out? People who want to be found usually don't wait for a funeral. Ms. Vance didn't look away. She didn't offer a pitying smile either. She just took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind people take when they're about to reveal a secret they've been guarding for a decade. I see the doubt in your eyes, Caleb. And honestly, you have every right to be angry. You think he forgot you, but the truth is, Arthur spent the last 6 years building a fortress around you. Not a fortress of stone, but one of legal documents and quiet, agonizing patience. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. When your father died, and your mother, when she couldn't care for you anymore, Arthur tried to come for you immediately. He hired me the day you entered the system, but the world of adults isn't as simple as a grandfather wanting his grandson. He was an elderly man, living alone on a rugged, isolated orchard with health issues that were already beginning to show. The courts looked at you, a child who had already suffered enough trauma, and they looked at him, and they decided you were better off in the system. They called it professional care. Arthur called it a tragedy. I felt something twist in my chest. For years, I had told myself that I was a mistake the world was trying to erase. I'd seen that look on the faces of social workers plenty of times. The one that says, you're just a file, a number, a problem to be managed. He knew that if he fought the state too aggressively, they might deem him unfit or disruptive to your placement, Ms. Vance continued, her voice softening. If that happened, they could have cut off his access to you forever. He couldn't risk losing the only connection he had left. So, he did the only thing the law allowed. He became a shadow. She pulled a thin ledger from her briefcase. Caleb, did you ever wonder why this facility always seemed to have just a little more than the others? Why your tuition for that summer tech camp was suddenly covered? Or how your medical bills were paid by an anonymous endowment when you were 12? You thought you were just lucky, didn't you? I froze. I remembered those moments. I remembered the music lessons I wasn't supposed to be able to afford, and the new pair of boots that appeared on my bed when mine were falling apart. I'd always assumed it was some faceless bureaucrat checking the wrong box in my favor, or a random act of charity from a local church. Arthur sent money every single month for 6 years, she whispered. He received every one of your report cards. He saw every photo the caseworkers took. He knew when you were struggling in math, and he knew when you won that track meet. He was waiting, Caleb. He was counting down the days to your 18th birthday just as hard as you were, because he knew that on that day, the courts would lose their power. He wanted to be standing at these gates himself to tell you all of this. He wanted to be the one to show you the trees. But his heart gave out 53 days too soon. I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of 2,190 days of silent protection. Those 2 weeks I said it took to find you, Ms. Vance said, standing up and gathering her things. I wasn't searching for your address, Caleb. I've known exactly where you were since you were 11 years old. I spent those 2 weeks tearing down the final legal walls, filing the last of the inheritance tax papers, and making sure that when I walked in here today, no judge or caseworker could ever tell you where to go again. Arthur spent 6 years building this fortress for you. I just opened the gate. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the ghost of a man I had never met, but who had apparently been watching over me from 300 miles away. I looked at the briefcase, at the photo of the orchard, and then at the rain. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a number. I felt like a son, or a grandson. I felt like someone who finally had a place to go. "The train leaves at 6 tomorrow morning," Ms. Vance said, her hand on the doorknob. "The ticket is in the file. It's time to go home, Caleb." I left Seattle on a rainy Tuesday morning, carrying my life in 2 duffel bags. The city was a blur of gray concrete and steel as the train pulled away from the station, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks sounding like a countdown. For years, my world had been defined by right angles, narrow hallways, square rooms, and the fenced-in yards of group homes. I was used to the noise of sirens and the constant low hum of millions of people living on top of each other. It was crowded, but it was predictable. As we crossed the state line into Oregon, the landscape began to shift. The buildings thinned out, replaced by towering pines that seemed to swallow the sky. We switched to a bus in Portland, heading west toward the coast. The air through the cracked window started to change. It lost that metallic, oily city tang and turned sharp, cold, and heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. By the time the bus dropped me off at a small stop near the town of Manzanita, the fog had rolled in so thick I could barely see my own boots. I started walking south along Highway 101, following the directions Miss Vance had left for me. To my right, I could hear the Pacific Ocean, a deep, guttural roar that felt more like a vibration in my chest than a sound. I couldn't see the water yet, but I could feel its scale. It felt infinite. And for a kid who had spent his whole life inside walls, that kind of space wasn't just beautiful, it was terrifying. I found the turnoff about 3 miles down. A weathered wooden sign hung by a single rusted chain, the words "Reed's Landing," almost worn away by decades of sea spray. The driveway was a narrow, winding track of crushed shells and gravel, hemmed in by ancient, gnarled trees that looked like they were leaning away from the wind. These weren't the neat, manicured trees you see in city parks. These were fighters. Their branches were twisted and scarred, covered in silver-gray moss that dripped with mist. As I reached the crest of the hill, the world suddenly opened up. The fog broke just enough for me to see it, the orchard. Thousands of apple trees were planted in neat, stubborn rows along the sloping cliffs, right up to the edge where the land fell away into the surf. The fruit was just starting to turn deep crimson, standing out against the dark, waxy green leaves. Below the cliffs, the ocean was a churning mess of white foam and iron blue water, slamming against the jagged rocks with a violence that made the ground tremble beneath my feet. Standing there, with the wind whipping salt into my eyes, I felt smaller than I ever had in Seattle. In the city, I was invisible because nobody bothered to look. Here, I felt invisible because the land was simply too big to care I was there. There were no locks here, no caseworkers, no lights out at 10 p.m. There was just the wind, the trees, and a horizon that didn't end. I looked at the old farmhouse sitting at the edge of the grove, a sturdy, wind-beaten building with cedar siding that had turned the color of a storm cloud. It looked like it had been standing there, holding its breath, just waiting for me to arrive. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and tasted something I hadn't expected. It was the smell of wood smoke and fermenting fruit. I'd spent 17 years wanting to be free, wanting to get out from under the thumb of the system. But as I stared at the wild, beautiful chaos of the Oregon coast, I realized I'd never actually known what freedom meant. It wasn't just the absence of walls, it was the presence of a choice. And looking at those trees, I realized for the first time that if I messed this up, there was no one left to blame but myself. I wasn't a ward of the state anymore. I was the owner of a cliffside, and the tide was coming in. I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning under my boots. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching me. I stood by the door, my duffel bags heavy at my sides, looking at the faded green paint and the rocking chairs that had been worn smooth by years of Oregon rain. I was about to knock when a shadow moved near the side of the barn. A man stepped out into the mist. He was stocky, wearing a stained canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. As he walked toward me, I noticed the way his left sleeve was pinned neatly to his shoulder. He only had one arm, but he moved with a kind of balance and purpose that made you forget it was missing. His face was like the bark of the old apple trees, deeply lined, weathered, and tough. This was Elias Thorne. "You're late," he said. His voice was like a low rumble of thunder, dry and blunt. He didn't offer a smile, and he didn't offer to help with my bags. He just stood there, his sharp blue eyes scanning me from head to toe, landing on my clean sneakers and my uncalloused hands. "The bus was delayed in Portland," I muttered, feeling that familiar urge to pull up my shield. "I'm Caleb." "I know who you are," Elias said, stepping onto the porch. He smelled like wood smoke, old grease, and fermenting apples. "I worked this land with Arthur for 30 years. He talked about you, though I reckon he left out the part where his air looked like he'd never spent a day out of the shade." I felt my face flush. "I didn't ask for this place, Elias. I'm just here because I have nowhere else to go." Elias turned, his one hand gripping the porch railing. "That's the problem with kids like you. You think this is a refuge. You think you can just sit on this porch and watch the sunset while the bank waits to take the keys." He gestured with his chin toward the sloping hills of the orchard. "There's 3,000 trees out there, Caleb. Half of them are overdue for pruning. The irrigation lines in the south block are leaking salt water, and the press in the cellar has a blown seal. If we don't have a harvest ready for the cider distributors in 60 days, the Reed name is gone. Forever." He walked past me, heading toward the barn, expecting me to follow. I dropped my bags and hurried after him, my feet sinking into the damp, black mud. Inside the barn, the air was cold and heavy. Massive wooden barrels lined the walls, and in the center stood a towering iron press that looked 100 years old. "Arthur kept this place running on pure stubbornness and prayer the last 2 years, Elias said, tossing a rusted wrench onto a workbench with practiced ease. He was sick, and he was tired, but he wouldn't let it go. "He was saving it for you. But look at you. You've got city lungs and thin skin." "I can work," I snapped, my voice echoing in the rafters. Elias stopped. He turned and looked at me, a grim, humorless smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Work? You don't even know what that word means yet. Work isn't a shift at a hardware store. Work here is breaking the ice off the troughs at 4 a.m. It's hauling 50-pound crates up a muddy cliff until your back feels like it's snapping. It's staying awake for 48 hours straight because a storm is coming and the fruit is still on the branch." He stepped closer, his presence commanding the space. "This orchard isn't a gift, Caleb. It's a fight. It's a fight against the wind, the salt, and the debt. Arthur gave his life to this dirt. I gave my arm to it. What are you willing to give? I looked at the iron press, then out at the dark, misty rows of trees. For the first time, the $500,000 inheritance didn't feel like a winning lottery ticket. It felt like a mountain I was being told to move with my bare hands. The freedom I thought I'd found was gone, replaced by a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. "Pick up that crate," Elias commanded, pointing to a stack of heavy wooden bins in the corner. "The sun's going down, and we've got 4 rows to check before dark. If you're staying, you're working. If not, the road back to the bus stop is exactly 3 miles that way." I didn't say a word. I walked over, gripped the rough wood of the crate, and lifted. My muscles protested immediately, and the salt air stung my throat. I looked at Elias, his one arm already reaching for a ladder. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew that the system had taught me how to survive. But the orchard was about to teach me how to live, and it was going to hurt. "I'm staying," I said, my voice tight. "We'll see," Elias grunted. "Check the 3rd row, and don't trip over your own feet. We don't have time for injuries." The first week at the orchard nearly broke me. Every morning, Elias woke me at 4:30 a.m. with a heavy knock that sounded more like a challenge than an invitation. My hands were a mess of blisters and small cuts from the rough bark, and my back felt like it had been hammered into a permanent arch. I spent those days hauling crates and learning the difference between a gala and a Braeburn, but I spent the nights in a house that felt like a museum dedicated to a man I'd never known. On Saturday evening, the fog was so thick you could almost lean against it. Elias had gone into town, leaving me alone with the roar of the ocean and the eerie silence of the trees. I found myself walking toward the center of the orchard, where the mother tree stood. It was a massive, ancient King of Tompkins County apple tree, its trunk so wide it would take 3 of me to reach around it. Its branches were heavy and twisted, reaching out like gnarled fingers against the gray sky. Arthur had mentioned this tree in his will. He called it the Heart of Reed's Landing. As I ran my hand over the rough, moss-covered bark, my fingers caught on something. A slight, unnatural edge in the wood. I leaned closer, pulling back a thick layer of silver lichen. There was a small, hinged wooden door built right into a hollow in the trunk, so perfectly crafted it was almost invisible. My heart was thumping against my ribs as I pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect them from the damp sea air, were 2 items: a battered, leather-bound sketchbook and a small box of cassette tapes. I took them back to the farmhouse, sitting at the kitchen table with only a single lamp burning. I opened the sketchbook first. I expected drawings of trees or maps of the land. Instead, I saw my own face. There were dozens of sketches. Me at 10 years old, sitting on a bench at a park I remembered. Me at 13, wearing a track jersey. Me at 16, leaning against the counter at the hardware store in Seattle. Arthur had been there. He had sat in his truck or stood across the street, and he had drawn me. He hadn't just sent money. He had studied the way I moved, the way I frowned when I was thinking, the way I looked when I thought no one was watching. Underneath a sketch of me looking particularly lonely at a bus stop, he had written, "He has his father's eyes. I hope he has more than just my stubbornness." I reached for the first tape, labeled Day 1, and pushed it into an old Sony Walkman I found in a drawer. The static hissed for a moment, and then a voice filled the room. It was deep, shaky, and carried the slow, melodic cadence of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to the tide. "Caleb," the voice said, "if you're hearing this, it means Eleanor found you. It means you're standing on the cliff, probably wondering why an old man you never met decided to tether you to a bunch of trees and a pile of debt. I don't blame you for being angry. I spent 30 years being angry at your father for leaving, and 40 years being angry at myself for letting him go. There was a long pause, the sound of a heavy sigh, and the distant cry of a seagull in the background of the recording. Making cider isn't about the fruit, Caleb. It's about time. It's about knowing when to wait and when to press. I missed my window with your father. I was too hard, too rigid, like an old branch that snaps instead of bends. By the time I realized my mistake, he was gone. And then you were born, and I thought I'd get a second chance. But the law is a cold thing, and my house was too quiet for a child, they said. Arthur's voice broke slightly, then grew more urgent. I'm recording these because the fog is coming for me, Caleb. Not the fog off the Pacific, but the one inside my head. The doctors call it Alzheimer's. I call it the Great Erasing. Some days I look at the mother tree and I can't remember who planted it. Some days I look at your pictures and I can't remember your name. I'm losing the pieces of my life, one by one. I had to hide these tapes while I still knew where the Huck K was. I sat frozen, the headphones pressing against my ears. The man wasn't just old, he was disappearing. I left you the orchard because it's the only thing I have that's real. It's a place where things grow, even when the wind tries to tear them down. You don't have to be a farmer, Caleb. You don't even have to stay. But I wanted you to know that you come from somewhere. You come from people who didn't give up, even when the fog rolled in. There's a recipe in the back of the sketchbook for the vintage special. It's the cider that saved this farm in 1968. It's the only thing that can save it now. Elias knows the work, but he doesn't have the heart for the blend. Only a reed can do that. The tape ended with a soft click. I sat in the dark kitchen, the smell of salt and old paper surrounding me. I looked at the sketches of my own life, drawn by a man who was losing his own. He hadn't just left me a farm. He had left me his memory. He had entrusted me with the parts of himself he was terrified of losing. I looked at my blistered hands. They didn't feel like the hands of a foster kid anymore. They felt like the hands of a reed. I opened the sketchbook to the last page and found the recipe, written in a shaky but determined hand. The Great Erasing might have been coming for Arthur, but as long as I was standing on this cliff, I wasn't going to let it take the orchard, not without a fight. The following Monday, the mist was so thick I could barely see the shears in my own hand. Elias didn't care. He was already out in the north block, his silhouette a ghost among the trees. "Light and air, Caleb," he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the surf below. "That's the secret." You aren't just cutting wood. You're deciding where the sun gets to go. If the heart of the tree is dark, the fruit will be bitter. I spent the next 14 days leaning into the wind, learning the language of the orchard. Elias was a hard teacher. He didn't use many words, but he expected me to remember every angle of a cut, every sign of a pest, and every rhythm of the season. Beside me, Barnaby, the old cattle dog, became my constant shadow. He didn't ask for much, just a scratch behind the ears and a share of my sandwich at noon. But having him there, leaning his warm weight against my leg while I worked, made the silence of the cliffs feel less like a void and more like a conversation. My hands changed first. The skin thickened, the blisters turned into calluses, and the constant ache in my shoulders settled into a steady, reliable hum of strength. But the real change was happening inside my head. In Seattle, I'd spent 17 years in a state of waiting. I was waiting for the next foster home, waiting for the caseworker to call, waiting for my mother to show up, waiting for the clock to run out. It was a passive, suffocating existence that left my mind spinning in circles of what if and why me. But here, the land didn't give me time to wait. If a line broke, I had to fix it. If a storm was coming, I had to brace the younger trees. I've wondered since why I didn't just sign those papers Ms. Vance brought and take the money. I could have had $500,000 and a ticket to anywhere. I could have gone to a beach in Mexico or a high-rise in New York and never looked back. But I stayed. I stayed to shovel compost and haul heavy crates in the rain. There's a reason for that, something I didn't understand until much later. Modern science calls it behavioral activation, but on the cliffs of Oregon, I just called it getting my hands in the dirt. In the group home, I was trapped in my own head, drowning in cortisol, that stress hormone that keeps you in a constant state of fight or flight. But when you start interacting with the physical world, when you care for a living thing like an apple tree or a dog like Barnaby, your brain chemistry begins to shift. Every time I finished a row of pruning, I felt a small hit of dopamine, that earned sense of accomplishment. Every time Barnaby looked up at me with those trusting eyes, my brain released oxytocin, the chemical of connection that I had been starved of for a decade. The sheer scale of the Pacific Ocean and the ancient trees worked to lower my stress levels, grounding me in a way concrete never could. I was moving from being a victim of my past to a master of my reality. One afternoon, Elias stopped me as I was finishing a particularly difficult section of the old king trees. He took the shears from my hand, inspected the cuts, and then handed them back. He didn't say, "Good job." He just said, "You're learning to listen to him. That's more than most." That night, I didn't stare at the ceiling and count the days until my 18th birthday. I didn't feel the need to check the locks or hide my duffel bags under the bed. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, my body exhausted in a way that felt earned and satisfying. I realized then that Arthur hadn't left me this orchard to make me a farmer. He left it to me because he knew I was broken. He knew that the system had taught me how to survive, but it had never taught me how to grow. He knew that the only way to heal a soul that has been uprooted too many times is to give it a piece of ground and a reason to stay. The apple trees were twisted, scarred, and beaten by the salt wind, but they were still standing, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was too. I wasn't Caleb Reed, the foster kid from Seattle. I was Caleb Reed, the man who was bringing the light back into the heart of the orchard. And as the sun began to set over the iron-blue water, I knew I wasn't just working for a harvest. I was working for my life. The 60-day clock didn't tick. It hammered. Miss Vance called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tighter than usual, stripped of its professional calm. The county was moving forward with the foreclosure. There was $85,000 in back taxes and unpaid equipment loans that Arthur had taken out to keep the orchard afloat while he was too sick to work. If I didn't have the money in the bank by January 1st, the Reed name would be stripped from the deed and the land would belong to the state. A few days later, a sleek black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway, kicking up dust that smelled of salt and decay. Two men in expensive wool coats stepped out, looking at the sloping cliffs like they were a pile of lumber waiting to be cleared. They represented a resort group out of California. They offered me $100,000 to sign over the rights right then and there. "Think about it, Caleb," the taller one said, glancing at my muddy boots and the frayed sleeves of my jacket. "You're 17. You could go back to Seattle, buy a car, get an apartment. Why stay here and kill yourself for a view you're eventually going to lose anyway? You don't owe this dead man anything." I looked at the mother tree, its branches swaying stubbornly in the wind, then back at the check in his hand. For a split second, the foster kid inside me screamed to take it. I wanted to be the boy with a bank account. I wanted to be free of the mud and the cold. But then I thought about the sketchbook. I thought about the man who had drawn me from across the street for 6 years because he wasn't allowed to hold me. I thought about Elias, who had given his arm to this dirt. "Get off my land," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Elias didn't celebrate when they sped away. He just spat on the ground and looked at the darkening horizon. "You better be right about that recipe, kid," he grunted. The vintage special was our only shot. It was a high-gravity artisanal blend that required the fruit from the mother tree and a specific slow fermentation process that Arthur had perfected decades ago. The distributors in Portland were willing to pay a premium for it, enough to bridge the gap, but only if the quality was perfect. Then the storm hit. A pineapple express, they called it. A massive atmospheric river that slammed into the Oregon coast with 70-mile-per-hour winds. The rain didn't fall. It drove sideways, stinging my skin like needles and turning the orchard into a slurry of black mud. We had 48 hours to get the fruit off the mother tree before the wind stripped the branches bare or the moisture turned the crop to rot. I spent those 2 days living in a yellow slicker, soaked to the bone despite the gear. The ladders were lethal, slick with salt spray and moss. I hauled 50-pound crates up the muddy slopes until my knees buckled and my breath came out in ragged, sobbing gasps. Elias was right beside me, working with his one hand, his face set in a mask of grim determination. We didn't talk. We didn't have the breath for it. We just fought. By the second night, my fingers were so cold I couldn't feel the stems. I slipped on a wet root and went down hard, a crate of apples spilling into the black mud. I sat there in the dark, the rain pouring over me, and for a moment, I just wanted to stay down. The independent Caleb, the one who didn't need anyone, whispered that this was a mistake, that the system was right. I was a child who couldn't be trusted with something this big. But then Barnaby nudged my shoulder, his fur matted and wet, his tail giving a single, encouraging thump against my leg. I looked up at the mother tree. It had been standing on this cliff for 100 years. It had survived 1,000 storms, just like this one. It didn't ask for permission to stay. It just dug its roots deeper. I stood up. I wiped the mud from my eyes, picked up the crate, and started again. We got the last of the fruit into the cellar just as the power went out. By the flickering light of a dozen lanterns, we started the press. The smell of the mother tree fruit was incredible, sweet, sharp, and deep, like the very essence of the earth. As the golden juice began to flow into the oak barrels, I realized something. This wasn't about the $85,000. It was about the fact that for the first time in my life, I was fighting for something that belonged to me. I wasn't a ward of the state waiting for a caseworker to decide my future. I was pressing it out of the dirt with my own 2 hands. The 60 days were still counting down, but the soul of the orchard was still ours. By the 3rd morning after the storm, I was finished. My hands were so swollen I couldn't even make a fist, and my knees felt like they were filled with crushed glass. I sat on the porch steps, staring at the thousands of apples still clinging to the trees in the north block. The vintage special was fermenting in the cellar, but it wasn't enough. We needed the full harvest to clear the debt, and between Elias's one arm and my total exhaustion, we were losing the race against the rot. I looked at the bus pass Ms. Vance had left in the file. It was still there, tucked into my pocket. I thought about the resort developers and their $100,000 check. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a kid, playing at being a man, trying to hold on to a ghost's dream. I was ready to call Miss Vance and tell her to bring the papers. I was ready to let the fog take it all. Then, through the gray curtain of mist at the bottom of the driveway, I saw a flash of yellow, then red, then the low, grinding rumble of engines. I stood up, my heart sinking. I thought it was the bank coming early. I thought they had seen the storm damage and decided to end it now. But as the vehicles got closer, I realized they weren't sleek black SUVs. They were battered pickup trucks with rusted beds and hay-baling wire holding the mufflers together. The first truck to pull up was a faded blue Chevy. Out stepped a woman who looked like she was carved out of driftwood, sharply dressed in a thick wool coat and boots that had seen 1,000 harvests. This was Martha Chen, the neighbor from the property to the east. Behind her, 3 more trucks pulled in, filled with men and women in work gear, carrying their own picking bags and ladders. "Elias told me you were trying to do the North Block by yourself, kid," Martha said, not waiting for an invitation. She walked up the steps and handed me a thermos that smelled of black coffee and cinnamon. "That's not how we do things around here, not on Arthur's land." I stared at her, then at the 20 people now spilling out of the trucks and heading toward the trees without being told where to go. I can't pay you," I stammered. "I don't have anything." Martha stopped and looked me right in the eye. "We aren't here for your money, Caleb. We're here to pay a debt that's 20 years old." She gestured toward the orchard. "In 2005, when the Great Freeze hit and my husband was in the hospital, Arthur Reed spent 3 nights in my groves with smudge pots, saving my crop while his own trees froze. He never sent a bill. He just told me to keep the jam coming." Then came Tom Kowalski, a man with hands the size of dinner plates, who slapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Arthur was the one who drove my daughter to the ER in the middle of a blizzard when my truck wouldn't start. He didn't just grow apples, son. He grew favors. And it's time for a harvest." For the next 10 hours, the orchard didn't feel like a lonely cliffside anymore. It felt like a hive. There was the constant thwack of ladders hitting branches, the rhythmic thump of fruit hitting the bottom of bins, and the sound of laughter and shouting that drowned out the roar of the ocean. They worked with a speed and precision I hadn't even imagined. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the mist in shades of orange and violet, the North Block was cleared. Every single apple was in a crate, stacked and ready for the distributors. I stood in the middle of the grove, watching these strangers, people I'd spent weeks avoiding because of my independent shield, sharing sandwiches and coffee around the back of a truck. I realized then that I had been wrong about Arthur. I thought he had lived a solitary, lonely life on this cliff, disappearing into his own mind. But looking at the faces around me, I saw that he had woven himself into the very fabric of this coast. My shield didn't just crack, it shattered. I'd spent 17 years believing that being tough meant being alone. I thought that needing people was a weakness that the system would exploit. But as Martha handed me a piece of apple pie and told me a story about my father when he was 10, I realized that community isn't a crutch, it's a root system. Arthur Reed hadn't just left me 300 acres of land. He had left me a family that didn't share my blood, but shared my history. He had built a fortress of people who showed up when the storm hit. I looked at the mother tree, and for the first time, it didn't look like an ancient, scary giant. It looked like a witness. It had seen Arthur's kindness, and now it was seeing mine. I wasn't just a boy with a backpack anymore. I was a Reed. And in coastal Oregon, that meant I would never have to fight the fog alone again. The night before January 1st was the quietest I had ever known. There was no wind, no rain, just the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the Pacific Ocean against the cliffs. I sat at the kitchen table, the air smelling of cedar wood and the sharp, sweet tang of the vintage special fermenting in the cellar. Tomorrow morning, Ms. Vance would arrive with the bank officials. Tomorrow, the $85,000 would either be in the account or I'd be packing my duffel bags again. I found the final box tucked far back under Arthur's bed, wrapped in a moth-eaten wool blanket that smelled of lavender and old age. It was a simple wooden chest, smaller than the others, with a heavy iron latch. My hands, now rough and scarred from 2 months of salt and bark, trembled as I flicked it open. Inside sat a heavy brass compass. It was an antique, the metal worn smooth by generations of hands, its needle still spinning with a steady, quiet confidence. Tucked beneath it was a single envelope. The handwriting was different this time. It wasn't the shaky scrawl of the tapes. It was clear, firm, and deliberate. The letter Arthur wrote before the fog in his mind took everything else. Caleb, it began. If you are holding this compass, it means the orchard is still standing. It means you chose to fight for a man you never knew and a life you never asked for. And for that, I am both proud and deeply sorry. I leaned back, the cold brass of the compass pressing into my palm. I spent 40 years thinking this land was the only thing that mattered, the letter continued. I thought being a reed meant being tied to these cliffs, pressing these apples, and surviving the winter. I forced that belief on your father until he broke. I thought I was giving him a kingdom, but I was really giving him a cage. I realized too late that a legacy isn't a piece of ground you own. It's the strength of the person standing on it. Arthur's words seemed to echo in the silent house. I didn't leave you this orchard because I wanted another cider maker. I left it to you because you were a boy with no North Star. I wanted you to have a place where you were the master, not a ward. I wanted you to have the choice I never gave my son. If you want to sell it, sell it. If you want to burn it down and walk away, do it. This compass isn't to help you find your way around the orchard, Caleb. It's to help you find your way back to yourself. I sat there for a long time, watching the needle settle on north. I realized then that my anger at Arthur, and even my anger at the system, had been misplaced. I thought I was fighting to keep a farm. I thought I was fighting for property. But as I held that compass, I understood that I was actually fighting for my own identity. I know some of you watching this might be thinking about your own lives. You might be looking at your bank account or your empty hands and feeling that same bitterness I felt. You might think, I didn't get a grandfather with a cliffside orchard. I don't have a $500,000 dichuk waiting for me. And you're right. Most of us don't. But as I sat in that dark kitchen, I realized that Disan, true legacy, isn't about property deeds or savings accounts. It's something much more resilient. It's the Wanko, to not give up when the world tells you you're nothing. It's the Kianchi, to fix a fence in a storm even when you're exhausted. If you've lived through trauma, if you've survived being overlooked or abandoned, you already possess the most valuable inheritance there is, the Gen Gwasukkin Gung. Money can be lost. Land can be seized. But the fact that you are still standing, still trying, still searching for your own north, that is a wealth that no bank can ever touch. Arthur didn't give me the orchard to make me rich. He gave it to me so I would realize I was already strong enough to survive without it. The vintage special wasn't just a recipe for cider. It was a reminder that even the most bruised fruit, when pressed with enough patience and fire, can become something legendary. I stood up and walked to the window. The first light of January 1st was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray ocean into a sheet of hammered silver. I heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Ms. Vance was here. I didn't feel the panic I'd expected. I didn't feel like the foster kid counting down the days. I reached out and touched the window pane, looking at the mother tree. I knew then what I was going to do. I wasn't staying because I had to. I was staying because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly which way was north. I put the compass in my pocket, picked up the file, and walked out to meet the world. A year has passed since that first winter storm nearly swept me off these cliffs. It's October again, and the air at Reed's Landing is thick with the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples. As I stand on the porch, watching the morning mist cling to the twisted branches of the mother tree, I realize I'm no longer staring at a calendar. I'm not counting the days until someone tells me to leave. For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting. I'm building. The orchard is thriving. The vintage special didn't just clear the debt, it put the Reed name back on the map. But as I looked out over these 300 acres, I realized something. This land was too big for one man's solitude, no matter how much I'd grown to love the work. It was too vast to be just a sanctuary for my own healing. I kept thinking back to that common room in Seattle, to the faces of the kids who were still staring at the walls, terrified of their own 53rd day. I remember that look. It's the look of someone who believes they are invisible. I sat down with Elias and Ms. Vance a few months ago. I told them I wanted to start something new. I called it the starting field. We decided to open the orchard every summer to 2 or 3 kids from the foster system who are about to age out. We provide them a place to stay, a fair wage, and a chance to learn everything Elias and Arthur taught me. Last week, the first 2 arrived. A girl named Maya and a boy named Leo. When they stepped off the bus, they had that same shield I used to carry, the hyper-independence, the hard eyes, the duffel bags held like anchors. I saw them looking at the cliffs, overwhelmed by the roar of the Pacific and the sheer scale of the trees. I didn't give them a speech about family or miracles. I just handed them each a pair of work gloves and pointed toward the north block. I told them what Elias told me. This isn't a refuge. It's a fight. But for once, it's a fight for something that's yours. Watching them work has been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I see the change in them every day. I see Maya's shoulders drop as she learns to trust the weight of a ladder. I see Leo's anger soften as he spends his afternoons with Barnaby, realizing that not every living thing is going to leave him. We aren't just teaching them how to press cider. We're teaching them how to have roots. I don't want them to have to wait for a ghost to leave them a fortune. I want them to know that their hands are capable of creating their own ground, right now. I want them to see that the 54th day doesn't have to be the end. It can be the morning of the harvest. Elias grumbles about the extra noise, but I've seen him showing Leo how to fix a leaking irrigation line with a patience he never showed me. He knows what I know. Arthur would have loved this. He would have grumbled too, but he would have sat on this porch, sketching their faces, proud that the Zhen Kwosuk Ginkung he passed to me is now being shared with others. I used to think that being a Reed meant inheriting a farm. Now I know it means inheriting a responsibility. I spent 17 years as a receiver, waiting for a check, waiting for a meal, waiting for a home. But standing here, watching Maya and Leo haul crates toward the barn, I realized that the true transformation isn't found in what you get. It's found in what you are finally strong enough to give away. I'm not a ward of the state. I'm not a foster kid with a backpack. I'm the steward of a starting field. And as the sun breaks through the Oregon mist, illuminating the crimson fruit of the mother tree, I know that the greatest thesan Arthur Reed left me wasn't the land. It was the chance to make sure no one else has to fight the fog alone. We're pressing the cider, we're mending the fences, and one by one, we're turning invisible kids into masters of their own destiny. That is the Reed legacy, and it's only just beginning. The sun is finally breaking through the heavy Oregon mist, turning the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold. I'm standing under the mother tree, the same ancient king apple that Arthur sat under for 50 years. The bark is rough and cold under my hand, smelling of damp moss and wood smoke. But the roots, the ones I spent all year helping him save, feel solid beneath my boots. I reach into my pocket and feel the weight of the brass compass. I don't need to look at the needle anymore. I've realized that belonging isn't something that's handed to you in a lawyer's office or written on a property deed. It isn't a gift. It's a ban zao gao, a contract you sign with yourself every morning when you decide to stay, to work, and to forgive. I think back to that Tuesday in Seattle, staring at the gray rain and counting down the 53 days until I disappeared. I thought the system was my whole world. I thought I was a mistake that needed to be managed, a problem that would eventually be solved by a backpack and a cold sidewalk. But as the salt wind whips through the orchard today, I see Maya and Leo heading out to the North Block with Barnaby trailing behind them. I see a legacy that isn't made of land or money, but of second chances. Arthur Reed waited until he was a ghost to reach out to me, but he was right about one thing. It's never too late to find where you belong. You come from people who worked hard, who valued integrity, and who made terrible mistakes but loved deeply anyway. If you're watching this and you feel like you're on the outside looking in, if you're staring at your own calendar, feeling like the fog has already swallowed your future, don't give up. You don't need a $500,000 inheritance to start building your own ground. You just need the nyuango to stand up one more time than you fall. I sat in that dark kitchen for months, feeling like a receiver, waiting for the world to give me something. But the real healing didn't start until I became a giver. It started when I realized that the strength Arthur left me wasn't in the trees, but in the gen he'd hidden in my own blood. We are all bruised fruit in some way, beaten by the storms of our past. But that doesn't mean we can't become something legendary. I want to hear from you today. Have you ever had a moment where everything changed? A time when life gave you an unexpected second chance, or when you finally found the place where you were meant to be. Maybe you've had to rebuild after a loss, or maybe you're still searching for your own north. Please, share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Your experiences are the roots of this community, and your words might be the compass someone else is looking for today. If Caleb's journey at Reed's Landing touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and join our starting field. We're dedicated to telling stories of resilience, of people who find light in the darkest corners of their lives. We'd be honored to have you as part of our family. The 60 days are over. The debt is clear. But the work, the real work of being a Reed, is just beginning. I look out at the horizon, where the iron blue sea meets the morning sky. And for the first time in my life, I don't see a wall. I don't see a countdown. I see a path. And as the sun warms my face, I know I'm not just standing on a cliff in Oregon. I'm home. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. I'll see you in the next story.